Why hello there. In this video I'm talking about the new Dark Souls the board game core set, the Sunless City. Now you might be asking yourself, didn't the Dark Souls board game come out like 6 years ago? And you'd be correct, the original Dark Souls dungeon crawler board game came out in 2017 and it was okay. Your party of 1 to 4 characters based on Dark Souls starting classes would make their way through a series of organically formed rooms that you'd clear of enemies in order to gain souls and draw new equipment, ultimately leading up to a mini-boss room where you'd have a big showdown. If successful, you'd reset the tiles with tougher enemies and repeat the process on your way to the main boss that would be the final confrontation of the game. If anyone in your party died at any point along the way through these rooms, you'd all be sent packing back to the bonfire where you'd need to repeat encounters to work your way back to the boss. This gameplay loop became tedious as the grind of clearing rooms and upgrading your party's gear lost its shine after the initial encounters, with subsequent journeys to the boss feeling like unwelcome padding between the players and the exciting, intense showdowns of the boss encounters. Players came up with house rules to address these issues, some of which became broadly adopted by the community. Steamforged Games, the developer and publisher of the game, took these house rules and other player feedback and revisited Dark Souls the board game. The end result was a revised rulebook and some new components. For players with the original game, the revised rulebook and new cards are available for download on Steamforged Games' website, linked below. For new players or those looking to get the revised components, Steamforged Games released a series of new modular core sets. These core sets contain everything you need to play the game with 1 to 3 players, but can also be combined with other core sets to up the player count to 4. Dark Souls the board game, the Sunless City, is the third of these reworked core sets to release, pitting players against the denizens of Anor Londo as featured in Dark Souls 1 over the course of 2+ hours according to the box, and easily 3 hours in my experience playing 2 multiplayer games and a solo game. The big questions are if these revised rules fix the issues with the original version of the game, and what the Sunless City core set brings to the table. Answering these questions and sharing my experience with the Sunless City core set will be the focus of my review. Let's get into it. The biggest change to the game comes in the form of the campaign board and the encounter cards. Instead of the rooms to the boss sprawling out around the bonfire tile, progress is tracked by moving along 10 encounter spaces along the campaign board, with the 5th encounter being the mini-boss and the final encounter being the main boss. When your party proceeds to a new encounter, you look at the difficulty for the spot on the campaign track, ranging from levels 1 to 3. The party draws 2 encounter cards from the encounter deck of the corresponding level, choosing one of the encounters to play based on the type of scenario or reward for completing it. Unlike the original game, in which the objective was always to clear the enemies in the room, encounter cards detail a different number of scenarios that range from killing all the enemies, to reaching a lever, to surviving a number of turns against a horde of foes, and more. These reimagined encounter cards bring a very welcome dose of variety to the game. While these scenarios don't always feel terribly soulsy, most of them do, capturing a wider breadth of scenarios that players find themselves in while playing through the video games. All of them involve combat to some degree, but having to dash for a lever to unlock a new room or manage a horde of grunts as you try to take out an elite enemy are reminiscent of experiences I had in the video games. More importantly, encounters as discrete individual scenarios, instead of part of an organic dungeon map, allow for a much larger design space to play with different ways of using the room tiles and putting in unique rules to give the game some much needed variety and more specific rewards. Some encounters give more souls with optional objectives, while others allow the party to search for specific equipment cards after completing the scenario. Having these more varied scenarios and rewards makes choosing between 2 at each stop more strategic and interesting, allowing parties to better play to their strengths and get the type of reward the party needs most. That being said, these revised rules don't totally alleviate the sense of tedium that can creep into the game. Similar to the original rules, if a character in your party dies or the objective has failed, everyone returns to the bonfire. Conversely, the party can also opt to return to the bonfire to cash in souls with the Firekeeper, or try their luck at getting some new equipment from Andre the Blacksmith. Regardless of the reason for returning to the bonfire, the spark dial goes down by 1. If the party returns to the bonfire and there are 0 sparks left on the dial, the game is lost. If the remaining sparks are more than 0, players must replay completed encounters from either the beginning of the campaign board or at the defeated mini-boss spot until they reach the next undefeated encounter. While the reworked encounters are more interesting, I still don't want to replay all of them to get to the next boss. The game takes 2 to 3 hours to play, and the time needed to set up and break down the encounters is not trivial. Setting up an encounter you've already completed feels like going through the motions again to make actual progress, which doesn't feel great. SFG attempted to mitigate this with a shortcut as a reward for some encounters, allowing players to start at the encounter after returning from the bonfire instead at the beginning. This feels like a half measure though. The system is thematic and made even more so with the shortcuts, but I think it is fundamentally a misguided approach to emulate this aspect of the Dark Souls games. In the video games, it only takes a few seconds of downtime with a loading screen to reset all of the enemy encounters along the way, but this becomes minutes of downtime between encounters in the board game. Anyone who's played the video games is familiar with that moment when you've had enough and adopt speedrun strats to run past all the enemies and traps to get to the next bonfire or boss, an option not available in the board game. The nature of boss runbacks also evolved over the series, which were largely eliminated by Dark Souls 3, and although shortcuts can emulate this in the board game, they're not guaranteed. So while the reworked encounters are much more interesting and offer better rewards, I still don't want to repeat encounters multiple times in a game, and the shortcuts you can potentially unlock feel more like a band-aid than a solution. Event cards are a minor addition to the game that ties into encounters. After completing an encounter, you draw an event card, and sometimes more as a reward. Event cards vary from being good to bad in nature, doing stuff like letting a player roll an extra dodge die in the next encounter, having the party draw an additional encounter card to choose from, or buffing enemy armor in the next battle. Event cards add another small wrinkle to the game that adds a bit of novelty to each encounter, even when they're repeated. Speaking of small, maybe this is because my game group is made up of people in their mid-30s, but a small gripe with these cards is the size of the text, which was pretty small and could be difficult to read. Time for Steamforged to produce some officially licensed Dark Souls binoculars to address this issue. There have also been some changes made to the combat system, the first of which is a reworked dodge and block dice system. When an enemy attacks a character, the controlling player rolls dodge and block dice generated by the character's equipment loadout to either completely avoid the attack by dodging it or mitigating damage by blocking it. In the initial rolls, players would choose between rolling dodge dice or block dice. In this reimagined version, it's no longer a choice and players roll both sets of dice. The cited reasons for this were to mitigate analysis paralysis by players and to make combat smoother, and it accomplishes both. While tactical decision making is fun, this puts further emphasis on holistically considering your character whilst at the bonfire or between encounters in a way that I found more satisfying. Instead of just leaning into one approach or the other, I found myself attempting to find a balance with my equipment that would allow me to have a chance at dodging while still having tough enough armor to withstand a few hits. The original version of the rules attempted to simulate choosing to raise your shield or roll away from enemy attacks in the video game. This new approach taps into the ethos of outfitting your character and balancing equip loads to achieve a certain class of rolling against damage mitigation. The latter is more interesting to me, adding a satisfying layer of strategy to equipping your character. Another change to the combat is the ability to move all characters on each player turn. In Dark Souls, the board game, all enemies take their turn, then a single character takes their turn, then all enemies take their turn again, then the next character takes their turn, and so on and so forth. While this is an incredibly canny way to scale the game and keep it balanced, there were some downsides in the original rules. This design led to more downtime for players between their turns. In addition, it could create scenarios where a player was in a suboptimal position, but the player could do nothing to address it because they wouldn't be going for another few turns. so SFG tweaked this system a bit, allowing inactive characters to move one node at the beginning of every player's turn. This helps mitigate downtime for players and increases tactical opportunities for the party. For example, during boss encounters, the initially randomized order of the boss attack cards remain in the same sequence, allowing players to anticipate upcoming attacks and organize the party to address them. As my party fought against the Titanite Demon, we used this revision to get up close and strike during its first few attacks, and then collectively backed away as its final pair of attacks made destructive sweeps along the battlefield. It was remarked at the table how this change allowed the group to better emulate the guerrilla warfare of the video games, where you space yourself to strike and punish certain attacks and back off to avoid others. This existed in the original Dark Souls board game as well, but it was also during boss encounters where characters were most likely to wind up in a bad spot with no options to avoid boss attacks. Letting characters move every player turn gives the party greater ability to strategically arrange characters to manage how enemies move and attack. Combine this with also reducing player downtime, and the result is more engaging encounters overall. Before moving on, I want to quickly address solo play. There are no changes between solo play and multiple players, but I did try a solo game and was very pleasantly surprised to find that it was really a lot of fun. Because of the turn economy where a player goes and then all enemies rinse and repeat, the game scales down as well as it scales up. The encounters were also well designed for a single player, and even found that encounters I'd played with a group took on new life when played solo, making everything feel fresh and challenging in new ways. The upcoming Elden Ring board game by Steamforged Games takes a similar approach with the turn economy, and I look forward to trying it solo as well after my experience with Dark Souls the board game. So all in all, the revised rules succeed in improving upon the original rule set. While they may not 100% fix my issues with the game, they are canny changes that make the game more dynamic and engaging. Now that we've discussed the revised rule set included in each of the new core sets, let's talk about the particulars of Dark Souls the board game, the Sunless City core set. The Sunless City core set, like the other core sets, is intended to be a standalone product with everything you need to get playing. If you have the original version of Dark Souls the board game, you already have most of the minis in this set, and can go onto Steamforged Games' website and download the new rulebook, encounters, and event cards, also linked below, which I think is a nice move by Steamforged Games. So while the Tomb of Giants and Painted World core sets acted as both revised standalone expansions with new minis for players with the original game, as well as a starter core set for new players, this core set is really aimed towards players looking to get into Dark Souls the board game. I like how these core sets each represent an area from the series, with the Sunless City being Anor Londo from Dark Souls 1. This set does a pretty good job of evoking Anor Londo with the enemies and bosses included, as well as the visual design of the boards reflecting the ornate architecture of the area, and the flavor of the encounters drawing inspiration from the fights and level design of the video game. While it's cool that each core set is standalone and thematically evocative of the area they represent, it's a bit of a bummer in that in order to get enemies and bosses from the other core sets, you have to buy an entire additional core set. This means that you're getting redundant components and minis that are shared between the sets. I'm not sure if it's intentional or an oversight, but while the rulebook outlines how you can bump the player count up to 4 using another core set, there aren't rules detailing how to mix and match the core sets. There are still plenty of expansion sets available from the original Dark Souls the board game that can be added to modify the experience, but I kinda wish it was easier to get the enemies and especially the bosses of the other core sets without having to buy a whole new core set to do so. And part of the reason I find this to be a bummer is because the Sunless City core set only comes with one mini boss, the Titanite Demon, and one main boss pair, Ornstein and Smo. Obviously production costs have risen since 2017, but the original game core set came with 3 mini-bosses and 3 main bosses to fight, including the Titanite Demon and Ornstein and Smo. Considering the bosses remain the highlight of the game, it feels a bit limiting to have static bosses to face in the core set, though I do understand that adding more bosses would jeopardize the relatively competitive price point. At least the fights are bangers, and in the few games I played, the boss fights remained interesting due to varied boss attacks and different party configurations. The regular enemies are slightly pared down from the original core set, including hollows, silver knights, and sentinels like you would find in the video game. This range of enemies was fine, in part because the increased variety of encounters included special rules and objectives to keep things fresh. The Mimic is a new addition to the game in this set, and the Sunless City comes with a wonderful Mimic mini that is well implemented in encounters through scenarios that explicitly feature the Mimic, or is added onto encounters as a looming threat. A confusing change found in this core set are newly designed character boards. In the original game, upgrades to stats as well as stamina and health were kept track of using wooden cube markers and tokens placed atop the character board. In these new core sets, these are tracked by double-sided tokens punched from the board that players then slot back in during play. These boards were pretty obnoxious. Removing the stamina and health tokens every turn was a pain, and I ended up resting the tokens just below the corresponding slots to more easily remove them. Most frustratingly, one of the players, not knowing any better, popped out the stat tokens on the character board, leaving a pile of seemingly random numbers to slot back in. We were able to tediously reconstruct the stats using a reference in the rulebook, but it wasn't an ideal start to the play session. Character board woes aside, the organization of the box is nice, with a convenient location for minis and components that makes it easy to set up and put away. Ultimately, the Sunless City core set is a nice package, especially for those like me who have a particular affection for Dark Souls 1 and really enjoy the translation of the Titanite Demon and Ornstein and Smo boss fights to the table. I do wish there was an easier and cheaper way to get my hands on the Gravelord Nito and the Bone Wheel skeletons found in the other core sets, but I can see myself grabbing another core set down the road to check out the encounters and special rules unique to each set. Steamforged Games' efforts reworking the rules for the Dark Souls board game were not wasted. The new structure, while at its worst still being a bit of a slog, is more engaging and fun to play thanks to the reworked encounters. The gameplay tweaks are minor yet very welcome changes, shoring up the weaknesses of the combat system while not sacrificing any of the strengths. If you already own the original Dark Souls the board game core set, I'd recommend downloading the revised rulebook and related components and giving it a try. The boss fights are still the highlight of the game, and while the Sunless City core set may not have much boss variety in the box, the bosses included are interesting and challenging encounters featuring some really nice minis. It's a nice way to jump into the board game for new players, especially those with nostalgia for Dark Souls 1. While the game is a bit too long to get regular play from me, I can see myself pulling it out from time to time when that familiar Souls itch overlaps with the desire to roll some dice. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and share it with another Dark Souls fan and board gamer in your life. Subscribe to the Lore Hunter for more Souls video game and board game content. Elden Ring the board game is slated for summer 2024, and it would be fun to cover that game as well. While video game content is my primary focus, I really enjoy discussing board games as well. If you'd like to see more board game content on the channel, especially video game crossovers, please leave a comment with your favorite board game adaptation of a video game or what video game you'd most like to see turned into a board game. I would personally go nuts if Steamforged and the Game Kitchen partnered up to give us a blasphemous board game. That would be a miracle. Thanks for watching.